Welcome back, Wanderer. Tonight, as the sky settles into that soft prehistoric hush, I invite you to lie down like a sleeping druid beneath the stars. Wherever you are in time or time zone, dim the lights, set the world to low, and let this become your portal into another era. Not a digital one, not a modern one, but a slow-breathing, lichen-covered one. Let your mind turn to chalk and mist. Let your limbs fall still like ancient stones, and join Mehe Re, between myth and math, where ghosts of giants still roam, and questions echo louder than answers. If you're new here, welcome to Sleepless Homo. This is where we tell the history of everything, softly. And if you find yourself dozing off along the way, that's not a failure. That's our goal. Stonehenge, they say, was not built. It was conjured, raised not by hands, but by incantation. Not with rope and log, but with riddle and rhyme. In the oldest tellings, those cobbled together in the early medieval fog of 12th century Britain, it was Merlin, the shape-shifting wizard of Arthurian fame, who called the stones into place. According to Geoffrey of Monmouth's popular chronicle written in the 1100s, the stones were stolen from the Giant's Dance in Ireland, a sacred site of healing magic built during the time of the legendary King Aurelius Ambrosius. Merlin, with a kind of magical engineering know-how, transported them across the sea and reassembled them as a memorial to the dead. In Geoffrey's vision, Merlin was not just a spellcaster, but a master of sacred architecture. He spoke to rocks like they were old friends. He tricked gravity. He convinced stones to fly. And while the tale might sound like medieval fan fiction, it was one of the most widely read histories of its time, a bestseller before the printing press. It helped cement Stonehenge not as a monument of ordinary labour, but of cosmic significance, one whose origins were too massive, too improbable, too strange to be explained by the simple human toil, and so for centuries it wasn't. Stonehenge was otherworldly and therefore exempt from the rigours of logic. It's easy to scoff at stories like that now, easy to laugh at the idea that a single wizard spirited monoliths from the hills of Ireland and plunked them down like Lego bricks on the Salisbury Plain. But the truth is that for more than 1,000 years, Stonehenge was known more by its myths than by its stones. Even in the Roman period, when legions marched past its ghostly silhouette, there is no written record of what they thought. No mentions in surviving annals, just a haunting silence. The place loomed, but it did not speak, and in that silence stories grew like moss. Some said the stones were petrified dancers turned to rock for defying sacred rhythm. Others believed they marked the site of a great battle, each slab a tombstone for a fallen king. In the 13th century, one cleric claimed the stones had been set by angels. Still another theory, offered centuries later, insisted it was the work of the devil himself. One version goes like this. Satan arranged the stones for amusement, flinging them from far-off Wales and laughing as they landed upright. A monk challenged him to explain their placement, and in his arrogance the devil obliged only to be thwarted when one stone fell and crushed his toe. Even well into the Enlightenment, Stonehenge defied scientific diagnosis. Antiquarians tried to date the stones by their style, by their weathering, by what they imagined the ancients capable of. Some believed the Romans had built it. Others traced it to the Danes or the Phoenicians. The circle resisted certainty. It became a blank stone page upon which every era could project its own obsessions. To the Romantic poets, it was sublime ruin. To the Victorian moralists, it was pagan folly. To modern-day solstice pilgrims, it's a hinge of time, a turning point where sun and spirit align. But rewind for a moment even further. Before Merlin, before monks, before ink touched parchment, the oldest human impressions of Stonehenge, though we can never fully know them, might have had nothing to do with magic or legend, and everything to do with sky. Because Stonehenge is not just a pile of rocks. It is, as we now know, a calendar in stone. Its orientation toward the solstices suggests that whoever first dreamed it into being was watching the heavens with deep, disciplined eyes. And this is where the blueprint becomes blurry. Because the Stonehenge we imagine today, the iconic horseshoe of towering trilithons encircled by a ring of standing stones, was not built all at once. Its construction spanned centuries, beginning around the year 3000 BCE, with a circular ditch and bank. That first phase wasn't even made of stone. It was chalk and wooden posts, a sacred outline drawn in the dirt. Within the bank, 56 mysterious pits, now called Aubrey Holes, were dug. Some held cremated human remains. Others we still don't know. It was a burial site, a gathering site, perhaps a site of slow construction, where every generation added their own layer of meaning. By around 2500 BCE, the Sarsen stones arrived monstrous slabs of sandstone weighing up to 40 tons each. These were not dragged from distant lands, but quarried some 20 miles north, likely in the Marlborough Downs. Even so, transporting them required feats of organisation and strength almost unthinkable without the wheel. Then came the bluestones, smaller but more mysterious. These were carried incredibly all the way from the Preseli Hills of southwest Wales over 140 miles away. Why? What power did those stones hold? Healing, memory, ancestral connection? No one knows. We do know that by the time the great trilithons were raised, each consisting of 2 upright stones, topped with a horizontal lintel, the builders had mastered the art of shaping and fitting stone. They carved mortise and tenon joints with astonishing accuracy, mimicking woodworking techniques in rock. The lintels were subtly curved to form a perfect ring, and the entire structure was levelled across a sloping landscape with optical precision. This was not a random pile of rocks. It was intentional, architectural, symbolic, and likely sacred. And yet we still ask, why? Why this shape, in this place, at this scale? Was it a temple to the sun, a stage for the dead, a celestial observatory, a royal court, a political symbol, a place to gather, to grieve, to sing, to survive? The stories never stop. The scientific consensus may lean toward multi-purpose use, burial, ritual, timekeeping, but the soul of the site remains elusive. Which brings us back in a way to Merlin. Not because he was real, but because the idea of him, the myth of a wise builder who sees the world in symbols and stars, feels somehow true. Whoever built Stonehenge was not simply piling rocks, they were arranging meaning. They were carving belief into stone. Whether or not they believed in magic, they certainly believed in something bigger than themselves. And so, even as we strip away the layers of legend, even as we scan and sample and radiocarbon date every inch of the circle, some part of us resists full understanding. We want there to be mystery. We want to believe the story isn't finished, that the stones still whisper, that somewhere, deep in the earth or high in the stars, the true blueprint remains folded waiting. In the next segment, we'll stay within this mythic fog and explore how Stonehenge became a beacon for neo-pagans, druids, and cosmic seekers long after the last Neolithic hammer fell on silent. It is midnight somewhere. Or maybe it's 3 in the morning, and your room is dim, the air heavy with silence, and all the loud questions of the day have finally curled up and dozed off in the corners of your mind. We're going back not just in time, but into myth, memory, and a strange kind of theatre made of stone. Dim the lights, loosen your grip on the present, and if you've ever watched the sunrise and wondered what it meant, you're in the right place. You're not just watching a documentary. There's a kind of theatre that happens only once a year, and only in a place like this. Picture it. The chill of a midsummer dawn on Salisbury Plain. Bodies wrapped in cloaks, faces painted in ochre, some barefoot, some chanting. Others are simply standing still, holding cameras or phones in trembling hands, waiting for something no touchscreen can ever quite capture. And when the sun finally rises behind the heelstone and pours itself into the broken teeth of the ancient circle, it doesn't just illuminate the crowd, it ignites a centuries-old fantasy. The Druids are back, or at least their dream is. It's one of the great ironies of Stonehenge that the people we most associate with it may never have touched it. The classical Druids of Iron Age Britain, the white-robed sages described by Roman authors like Pliny and Julius Caesar, were most active around the first few centuries before the Common Era. By then, Stonehenge had already been standing for over a millennium. Built primarily between the 3rd and 2nd millennia before the Common Era, the stone circle was already a silent witness to skies long forgotten by the time Druids were known to speak with trees. And yet the image persists. Druids in a circle performing rites in the sacred centre of Stonehenge. Why? Because history is rarely stronger than myth. And the myth of the Druid, that mysterious figure who dances between religion, philosophy, astronomy and poetry, was too powerful for the Victorian imagination to resist. It was in the 18th and 19th centuries that Britain truly revived its spiritual romance with the Druids. Men like William Stukeley, the antiquarian who coined the term patriarchal druidism, stood among the stones with biblical fervour, convinced they were altars built by wise and ancient priests. The newly fashionable grand tour of Europe wasn't enough. The mystical needed to be local. And what better way to elevate the soggy countryside than to crown it with spiritual grandeur? But the Druids of this revival weren't historical figures. They were projections, part romantic fantasy, part nationalist pride, and part reaction to the industrial age's smog and noise. Where better to escape the soot than a hallowed ring of stone bathed in celestial geometry and untouched by coal? In these centuries, Stonehenge became a canvas, a theatre for the lost rituals of a pre-Christian past. Poets, spiritualists and eccentrics began to gather at the site, writing hymns to the solstice, preaching about lunar alignments, and forming druidic societies with elaborate costumes and invented ranks. The most famous of these, the Ancient Order of Druids, founded in 1781, still holds ceremonies at the stones today. And what exactly did they do in these ceremonies? That, like the monument itself, is cloaked in ambiguity. Some rituals were performed silently, others involved recitations of Welsh poetry or improvised invocations of the earth, moon and sun. At times offerings were made. Water, flowers, a cup of mead. At others, just human presence staring up at the stones in reverence, hoping to catch a glimpse of something older than civilization but kinder than history. This spiritual nostalgia crested with the annual solstice celebrations. Though now regulated and supervised by English heritage, these gatherings bring thousands each year to Stonehenge, turning the site into a bizarre and beautiful blend of pilgrimage, protest and party. Neo-Druids, Goths, tourists, mystics, historians, and the simply curious arrive with drums, incense, and sometimes nothing more than their silence. And when the sun threads the needle between the heel stone and the axis of the monument, a murmur moves through the crowd. It is not factual confirmation, it's not proof, it's something quieter and stranger, a kind of mythic memory. And the solstice is not just symbolic, it is written in the architecture. Stonehenge is famously aligned with the midsummer sunrise and the midwinter sunset. The axis formed by the avenue and the arrangement of the sarsens is so precise that it draws a line across the landscape, connecting sky to earth in a moment of engineered awe. This isn't accidental, this is astronomy, but even this alignment fuels the druidic fantasy. What else could such a monument be for, if not celestial ceremony? Surely the ancients gathered here to worship the sun, to commune with the dead, to open the sky and close the year. And perhaps they did, but the idea that those ceremonies were druidic, specifically Iron Age or Celtic in nature, is likely false. The builders of Stonehenge were long gone before the Druids emerged from the mists of Caesar's chronicles. Still, the symbols overlap. Both the Neolithic builders and the later Druids were obsessed with cycles, seasons, death and renewal, stars and sacrifice. In this way, the modern solstice rituals are not incorrect. They are inherited dreams, echoes of echoing things. Even the architecture reflects this. The mortise and tenon joints used to slot the sarsen lintels onto their upright stones are engineering feats far beyond mere brute strength. They suggest planning, precision, and a sense of permanence. And what are druids, if not priests of permanence, keepers of cycles, architects of seasonal self-meaning? To look at Stonehenge today, after thousands of years, is to witness not just one spiritual story but the layers of many. The funerary ritual of the early Neolithic, the solar compass of the late Neolithic, the presumed sacredness of the Bronze Age barrow builders, the intellectual elegance of Iron Age philosophers, and the psychedelic flower child rites of the modern New Age solstice pilgrims. All of them kneeling in their own time before the same mute monument, all of them building their identity in the shadow of the stones. In this way, the Druids didn't build Stonehenge, but they may have built the idea of it, the idea that some places are inherently sacred, that the land can remember, that stone can speak if you know how to listen. And maybe that's enough, because whether they were latecomers or originators, romantics or ritualists, the Druids gave us the cultural permission to feel something when we stand here, to believe in thresholds and thrones, in seasons that whisper, and in stones that once a year open their mouths to swallow the sunrise. So the next time someone tells you Stonehenge was a clock or a temple or a graveyard, you can smile softly and say yes. But also, it's a stage, one where the soul performs its old rites, and the Druids, whether they knew it or not, helped write the script. But myths, of course, are only half the monument. For all the stories of Merlin's magic and Irish giants hauling monoliths across the sea on golden ropes, the stones themselves whisper something quieter, something stranger, something measurable. Take the altar stone long assumed to have come from the same Preseli hills that gifted Stonehenge its enigmatic blue stones. In the year 2024, researchers quietly overturned that century-old assumption. A single fragment, originally chipped from the block in 1844, was tested using uranium-lead dating and heavy isotope analysis. The results stunned the field. The chemistry matched not the Welsh uplands, but the Orcadian basin of northeastern Scotland, nearly 500 miles away. What followed was a flurry of recalibrations. What kind of society could transport a 6-ton megalith across rivers, mountains, and seas long before the invention of the wheel? That kind of reverence or ritual urgency justifies such burden. The altar stone is no local accident. It's central, heavy, and seemingly ceremonial, a sandstone anomaly in a sea of sarsens and dolerite. Its long migration, perhaps through a relay of riverboats, sledges, and sacred pauses, speaks to a Neolithic world more interconnected than we once imagined. Some now believe the stone may have been used in other monuments first, passed hand to hand like a relic, accruing significance before it ever stood at the centre of Stonehenge's ring. Modern scanning has also given us geometry we didn't expect. High-resolution LiDAR revealed that the Great Trilithons, the iconic 3 stone arches, weren't built as crude rectangles. The horizontal lintels were subtly curved, each one shaped to preserve a perfect ring. Stone Age engineers, working with nothing more than stone hammers and bone tools, carved a circle that could hold flat across uneven terrain. Even more staggering, the entire ring appears to be levelled, adjusted for the slight slope of Salisbury Plain using shorter stones on the uphill side. No spirit levels, no chalk lines, just inherited genius. And then there's the solar script. Everyone knows about the midsummer sunrise, how, on the longest day, the sun spills its golden light through the heel stone and into the monument's heart. But newer studies suggest that the winter solstice may have been the true axis mundi. On the darkest day of the year, the sun would set precisely between the tallest trilithons, illuminating the altar stone in one last burst of orange light before the long night. This alignment is exact, deliberate, and perhaps symbolic, not a celebration of life, but a confrontation with death, a promise that even the darkest cycle turns toward rebirth. Other stones seem to affirm this seasonal ritualism. The 4 so-called station stones form a rectangle that may have served as a lunar calendar, marking the complex cycle of moonrise and moonset over the course of the year. The avenue, a ceremonial path stretching 2 miles to the River Avon, also aligns with both solstices. The entire monument may have functioned as a kind of ritual clock, way to count the invisible, to commune with time itself. Beneath the stone lie the dead. Within the outer ditch, one of the first features built. Sometime around 30 centuries before Christ, archaeologists have found the cremated remains of over 60 individuals, some children, some adults, many placed in carefully arranged pits, known as Aubrey holes. Recent isotopic studies on their teeth and bones suggest these were not locals. Many were raised on granite-rich soils, pointing to childhoods in the west, possibly in Wales, perhaps even Ireland. Stonehenge, it seems, was a funerary gathering point, a terminal node in a web of prehistoric pilgrimage. And yet it was more than just a tomb. Its orientation, its shaping of light, its echoes across the plain all suggest that Stonehenge was a spiritual machine, an instrument tuned not to music but to meaning, a place to remember, to channel the cosmos, to watch the sky die and be reborn. Some modern researchers are beginning to reframe Stonehenge not as a singular event, but as a process. The site evolved for over 1,500 years. Phases came and went. Stones were moved, circles rearranged, monoliths imported. What if Stonehenge was never meant to be finished? What if the building was the ritual? The act of assembly itself, the centuries-long effort, the collaboration between distant communities was the point. And so as we peer beyond the mists of myth and into the measurable, we do not find clarity. we find something richer. A monument where science and story converge, where bones and light speak in harmony, and where the ghosts of giants, druids and Neolithic astronomers all seem to be telling us the same thing. Remember, mark the turning, carry the stone. We begin with a sound, not the silence of the Salisbury Plains at dawn, nor the chant of the solstice crowd waiting for light to slip between the lintels, but the deep hollow thud of wood against chalk, of stone scraping against bone. A sound that has not echoed in over 4,500 years, and yet still lives in the imagination. Because long before Stonehenge was a monument, it was a problem, a nightmare of logistics, a riddle of force and friction and human willpower. The problem? Take a block of sandstone weighing over 30 tons, carve it from a quarry 20 miles away, and drag it to a hill with no beasts, no carts, no metal, and not a single blueprint in sight. Solve that and you get the temple. The Neolithic people who first raised the sarsen stones were not working with a surplus of convenience. This was long before the wheel arrived in Britain, which likely happened sometime in the 3rd millennium before Christ. They were not aided by bronze or iron tools, which wouldn't shimmer into the island's story until much later. And yet, around 2,500 years before Christ, these same people shaped and shifted some of the heaviest stones ever moved by hand in prehistoric Europe. So how? The answer lies buried not just in the landscape, but in the human body itself. Because while we often imagine ancient construction as an exercise in brute strength, the truth is softer, stranger. It was about rhythm, teamwork so wet, the hypnotic pace of repetition. Imagine dozens of people looping thick ropes made of woven bark around a sarsen stone. Imagine wooden sedges, greased with animal fat, sliding over log rollers. Archaeologists believe they may have used timbers laid like railway tracks, replacing each one as they moved forward. It would not have been fast, perhaps a mile or two per day at best, and yet they kept going. Some modern reconstructions have attempted this feat. In 1995, a team at the Millennium Stone Project in Wiltshire tried to drag a stone weighing 10 tons overland using only Neolithic tools and methods. Even with a team of 100 people, the task was brutal. It took over a day to move the stone just a few hundred metres, and yet this was a stone only a third the size of Stonehenge's largest sarsens. And the Neolithic builders? They didn't just move the stones, they shaped them. Every surface of Stonehenge's upright stones was intentionally worked. The sides that face inward are smoothed and squared, their tops carved into gentle curves so that the lintels could sit evenly on the top. The mortise and tenon joints, that ancient woodworking trick usually reserved for dovetailing table legs, was repurposed into stone with astonishing precision. This wasn't guesswork. The lintels themselves are subtly curved, maintaining the illusion of a perfect ring. As laser scans have revealed, the builders didn't just raise a sickle, they sculpted one. But none of this answers the question of motive. Why do it? Why go through the agony of hauling something the size of a small house across forests and wetlands? Why insist on symmetry in a world without measuring tape? Part of the answer is spiritual. The people of the late Neolithic were not rational engineers by our standards, but they were builders of meaning. Alignment mattered. The stones marked the solstices with eerie perfection. On midsummer morning, the sun rises behind the heelstone and its rays shine into the heart of the monument. On midwinter evening, the sun sets between the tallest trilithons, casting long shadows toward the altar stone. That much geometry does not happen by accident. But it also speaks to something more primal, the desire to defy time. The sarsens are of the earth, ancient even in their raw state. To carve them was to tame time, to arrange them was to give structure to eternity. And perhaps most haunting of all, to move them was to carry a piece of that eternity in your hands. In 2020, scientists used geochemical analysis to confirm that most of the sarsen stones came from westwards in the Marlborough Downs, about 25 kilometres to the north. That means someone not only chose the stones, but chose the distance. They bypassed closer sources of sandstone in favour of this particular site, which may have held spiritual or symbolic meaning lost to us now. The cores extracted from one of the uprights in the 1950s, rediscovered decades later in the United States, revealed a unique geochemical fingerprint. Each stone from westwards shares this same signature, suggesting a coordinated and deliberate effort. This was not opportunistic. It was ritual logistics. And yet the path from quarry to plain was anything but simple. The landscape of southern Britain 5,000 years ago was not the rolling farmland we see today. It was a patchwork of thick forests, marshlands and chalk hills. The Sarsen haulers had to clear paths, build temporary roads, and possibly even construct rafts or sleds to cross wetter ground. Some researchers believe the River Avon may have been used to transport smaller stones, though there is less evidence for this with the Sarsens. Still, it is not unthinkable that part of their journey was by water. One theory suggests a technique called corduroy roads, layering logs side by side to create a flat rolling platform over difficult terrain. Another posits the use of A-frame sledges and pivoting rollers, akin to ancient cranes. But at the end of the day, the greatest technology was social. Moving a stone required not just tools, but trust, a shared vision, a sense of belonging so strong it justified back-breaking labour. This was collective devotion, turned architecture. It may be worth remembering too that these efforts took place across generations. The earliest phase of Stonehenge dates to around 3,000 years before Christ, with later additions continuing for 5 centuries. It was not a single act of madness, but a long relay of meaning. Grandparents began what their grandchildren finished. And so the 30-ton puzzle remains less about how the stones moved, and more about why the people did. What belief makes you drag the sky across a plain? What myth do you hold in your bones so deeply that stone itself becomes the only language left to speak it? The monument, for all its weight, speaks most eloquently through the absences, the gaps in its ring, the mystery of its alignment, the evidence of tools but not blueprints, the fact that every theory still begins with a shrug and ends with awe, because in the end the physics of pain may tell us how, but only the imagination can tell us why. And that's the most Neolithic mystery of all. If you've ever tried to hang a bookshelf or build a chair, you probably already know what the builders of Stonehenge would have called a Tuesday. Because sometime around the 25th century before the Common Era, with no steel, no tape measures, and absolutely no mercy from the weather, a group of Neolithic engineers performed a feat so absurdly precise it still stuns modern surveyors. They fitted massive horizontal lintel stones atop upright Sarsens using carved joints that echo modern woodworking. Tongue and groove, mortise and tenon all done in stone, with nothing but hammerstones and bone. The result? Not only do the uprights stand, but the lintels sit perfectly level, hugging the tops of the stone so tightly that several remain balanced to this day, even after 4,000 winters of rain, frost and wind. This wasn't just brute strength. It was geometry without numbers, engineering without theory and design without a blueprint. It was craft honed in silence, passed not by drawing but by doing. To understand just how staggering this joinery is, let's start with the scale, the average trilithon. The classic formation of 2 uprights and a single horizontal lintel rises more than 20 feet tall and weighs in at roughly 30 tons per stone. These Sarsens, made of incredibly hard silicified sandstone, were dragged from the Marlborough Downs some 20 miles to the north, most likely using sledges, wooden rollers and immense communal effort. But dragging them to the site was only the beginning. Once upright pits were dug, the stones were hauled into place, likely tipped vertically using levers and counterweights. Then came the real magic. The tops of the uprights were carved with a pair of tenon knobs, rounded protrusions like wooden dowels, while the underside of the lintels were carefully hollowed with matching mortise holes. In addition, a tongue and groove joint was used to fit the horizontal lintel stones to each other end to end, keeping the circle continuous and rigid. Now consider this. These joints weren't visible once set. They couldn't be trialled and errored like modern furniture parts in a factory. This had to be right the first time. A misaligned mortise would mean a 30-ton lintel doesn't sit flush or worse, topples, but that didn't happen. Instead, we have a circle of lintels that follow a curve so precise, modern archaeologists using laser scans discovered that the builders had subtly carved each lintel's outer edge into an arc. In other words, they didn't just stack slabs into a polygon, they carved stone to match an ideal circle, in 3 dimensions, with joinery that distributed the load cleanly across every junction. They even accounted for the slope of the Salisbury Plain, adjusting the heights of the uprights so that the lintel ring remains level to the horizon. This is the kind of subtlety that makes Stonehenge less a monument and more a manifesto, an announcement that humans, even in the Stone Age, were not just survivors but thinkers, builders, dreamers. How could they have done this without measurement systems, without trigonometry, survey equipment, or even writing? One theory suggests the use of ropes and pegs to map out circles and arcs, basic geometry by way of string and intuition. Others propose that repeated generational apprenticeship passed along not just technique, but an embodied understanding of shape and weight, much like how a violin maker or potter senses proportion with their hands, not numbers. The builders of Stonehenge, in other words, may have been working from deep cultural memory, a long line of trial, error, and physical wisdom passed through hands and stone, not spreadsheets. The tools they used were simple, but effective. Hammerstones made from harder rocks like dolerite or flint were used to chip away at the sandstone, a process that took hundreds of hours per stone. Chisel marks along the mortise sockets suggest repetitive pecking and gouging to hollow them precisely. And despite working with the irregular stone, the final shapes achieved remarkable regularity. The tenons on the uprights were rounded to fit their sockets snugly, distributing weight evenly and reducing lateral motion. The tongue and groove fittings between lintels made it possible for the circle to resist seismic shifts and weathering, locking each segment into its neighbours like a prehistoric jigsaw. Modern experiments have tried to replicate this craftsmanship. At places like the Ancient Technology Centre and Stonehenge Riverside Project, researchers and volunteers have used replica tools to carve mortises into sandstone blocks and found that while slow, the task is possible provided you have patience, coordination, and a stubborn belief in the tactile intelligence of the human hand. What these experiments show is that Neolithic people were not simply labouring at the whim of ritual. They were executing a vision, one that demanded immense skill in logistics, leverage, carving, and collaborative labour. This was not art for art's sake, nor architecture as afterthought. It was engineering as devotion. There's also the mystery of how they raised the lintels into place. One hypothesis involves building massive earthen ramps or timber scaffolds to the height of the uprights, then slowly hauling the lintel along rollers to the top. Others suggest levering from both sides with ropes and timber frames, gradually lifting the stone incrementally until it could be slid into place. However it was done, it left no obvious mark in the archaeological record, no carved scaffolds, no leftover machinery, just stones locked in place quietly defying gravity for 4,000 years. Even the decision to use mortise and tenon joints itself is telling. These joints weren't necessary for holding the stones in place. They could have simply balanced the lintels flat on the uprights, but they didn't. The builders took the harder route, shaping each pair to interlock, as if to make the structure a single unified body. That decision speaks of intentionality, of a symbolic, not just structural precision. It's possible that this joinery mirrored wooden structures from earlier periods, many of which are now lost to time. Or perhaps it encoded cosmological or cultural meaning, a connection between sky and earth, circle and square, permanence and passage. Whatever its deeper meaning, the craftsmanship of Stonehenge is not the relic of a primitive past. It is the fingerprint of a people whose intelligence and imagination reached across centuries to sculpt the sky. Mortis by mortis, trilithon by trilithon, they encoded time, memory, and gravity into stone. And every time we visit, measure, or marvel, we're not just looking at a ruin, we're reading the record of hands that knew more than we think. Hands that didn't just survive the Neolithic, they shaped it. We begin not at the stone circle, but on the earth that holds it. Because long before Stonehenge was a monument, it was a landscape. And that landscape was alive, with plans, with processions, with the pits that marked the sacred perimeter of memory itself. This was not just a collection of rocks, arbitrarily placed in a lonely field. This was choreography carved into their terrain. A system, a sequence, a kind of sacred calculus scratched into the chalky underlayer of southern Albion. And to understand it, we have to pull the camera back, far back, until the circle becomes a node and the plain becomes a labyrinth. Let us begin at Durrington Walls, a site that is somehow bigger, more complex, and in some ways more intimate than the more famous circle that would come later. It lies a mere 2 miles northeast of Stonehenge, but in function and spirit it may have been its mirror, or its rehearsal, or perhaps its companion in ritual death. Here, around the year 2600 before the Common Era, thousands gathered seasonally to build, feast and bury. We know this from the remains, splintered pig bones, roasted joints, scattered teeth. We know this from post holes and the ghostly outlines of timber circles. And we know this from the layout, meticulous, oriented, and aligned with solar intentions. Durrington was not made of stone, but of wood. The posts, long decayed, once stood in concentric rings. Unlike the Sarsens, these timbers rotted quickly. But perhaps that was the point. Wood was for the living, stone was for the dead. And in this binary we find something close to belief. Rituals of death, you see, were not performed only with mournful silence. They were enacted through seasons of preparation, the fattening of pigs, the carving of feasting vessels, the transport of ancestors across processional roads. One such road linked Durrington to Stonehenge, a route scholars now call the Avenue, and along this ceremonial corridor the living walked the dead to the land of stone. Now to the ground itself. In the summer of the year 2020, archaeologists made an astonishing announcement. Using magnetometry and ground-penetrating radar, they revealed a ring of deep shafts encircling Durrington walls. Each pit was more than 5 metres deep and 10 metres wide. They formed a perfect circle, nearly 2 kilometres in diameter. This wasn't a ditch. It was a map, an ancient blueprint, forgotten, buried, and suddenly revealed. These pits were not randomly dug. They appeared to form a kind of ritual boundary, a liminal line marking the edge between sacred and profane, memory and oblivion. And just like the lintels of Stonehenge, these pits were aligned with astronomical axes. North, south, midwinter, midsummer. They drew invisible lines across the land like constellations collapsed to Earth. Only this time, instead of guiding the eye to the heavens, they mapped memory into soil. What kind of society carves geometry into the dirt without writing, without wheels, without cities? A society that saw the land not as real estate but as scripture, that measured its seasons in bodies, its boundaries in bones. And at Durrington, the archaeology backs this up. The bones found there were not casual discards from village dinners. They were selected, slaughtered and ritually burned. The pigs had been fed rich diets, some likely imported from hundreds of miles away. They were feasted upon and left as offerings, teeth rotted from deliberate fattening. This was ceremony. And the timing, curiously, always pointed to the darkest months. The pigs were 9 months old at death, born in spring, sacrificed in winter. Midwinter, to be exact. This fits neatly with Stonehenge's own alignment. While modern pilgrims gather for the midsummer sunrise, the site's most accurate alignment is actually with the winter solstice sunset, when the sun sinks perfectly between the tallest trilithons, casting its final light on the altar stone. It mirrors the rituals unfolding at Durrington. The walking of the dead, the return to the underworld, the great hinge of the year turning toward new light. And what of these shafts? Why dig so deep, so wide, so laboriously? Some scholars suggest they held massive timbers. Others believe they were symbolic voids, emptiness as offering, depth as meaning. They may have been filled with water, creating shimmering mirrors to the stars above. Or perhaps they were simply markers, places to pause, to turn, to pray. In any case, they were not accidental. Their spacing is precise, their diameter consistent, their presence undeniably together. Stonehenge, Durrington walls, and this vast pit circle form a triptych of intention. One of stone, one of wood, one of void. A sacred triangle etched into the British landscape, readable only from above, and for centuries it remained hidden. Because for all our books and museums, for all our radiocarbon dating and satellite imaging, we are only now beginning to grasp the full scope of this Neolithic mindscape. Consider this. The pit circle around Durrington predates the Great Pyramid of Giza. It was built in an age with no metal tools, no draft animals, and no writing. The stones at Stonehenge weigh as much as 40 tons. The largest Sarsens travelled from Marlborough Downs 25 kilometres away. The blue stones came from Wales, 150 kilometres west. And now the altar stone appears to have originated in northeast Scotland, a journey of over 800 kilometres. This suggests not only coordination, but communication, trade, shared cosmology, shared labour, perhaps even shared governance. The Neolithic world was not a scatter of isolated hamlets, it was a network, and these monuments were not decorative. They were narrative. They told time, they shaped ritual, they stored memory in material form, and they did so not just through what was built, but through how the land was used. In the end, Stonehenge is only the centre of a larger system. It is the node, the anchor. But the rest, the rivers, the ridges, the pits, the paths all played their part in the script. And what a script it was. not written in ink, but in absence, in shadows cast across stone, in solstices and pig bones, in shafts that waited millennia to be found. This was not architecture, this was choreography. And the plain still dances. 2 miles of earth. 2 miles of chalk-lined reverence pressed into the soil like a memory still trying to walk itself home. This is the avenue, a prehistoric processional route carved by Neolithic hands that weren't simply building a road, but orchestrating a journey not for the feet, but for the soul. The avenue is what links Stonehenge to the River Avon, and its purpose was never mundane. It was not a trade route, not a pathway for farmers or flint carriers. It was ceremonial, deliberate, sacred, a liminal ribbon between worlds, and its alignment tilted ever so slightly toward the northeast reveals a choreography of time, light, water and death that no spreadsheet can capture. The path begins at Stonehenge itself, unfolding from the heel-stone like a quiet exhale. The heel-stone, that solitary sentinel, stands askew from the others, but not by mistake. On the summer solstice, the sun rises directly behind it and casts its light along the avenue, illuminating a path that has no lamps, only memory. At the opposite end of this Neolithic corridor lies the River Avon, meandering with the same careless wisdom as time itself. To modern eyes, a river may seem just a geographic convenience, but to Neolithic Britons, water was a threshold. Rivers divided the world of the living from the land of the ancestors. They mirrored the sky. They moved always, and in doing so carried the soul from here to there, from now to then. Recent archaeological studies, particularly those by the Stonehenge Riverside Project, have confirmed that the avenue was constructed with the same attention to solstitial alignments that define the monument itself. The avenue is not just parallel to the sunrise on the longest day of the year. It's tuned like an instrument. It captures not only sunlight but intent. Excavations have revealed parallel ditches flanking the avenue, their banks once gleaming with chalk, creating a visual corridor of light and bone. If one were to walk this route in its original state, the sensation would be less of a stroll and more of a rite. And this is likely what it was, a rite of passage, from river to stone, from earth to sky, from life to what lies beyond. The process, it seems, may have begun at Durrington Walls, just up the river from where the avenue terminates. Durrington was not a random Neolithic settlement. It was a feast site, a place of pork, pottery, and human assembly. Thousands would gather here, their animals fattened for the winter kill, their rituals timed with the midwinter solstice. When the feasting concluded, the journey commenced. Bodies perhaps of the elite, perhaps of the spiritually chosen, were carried from the world of the living to the realm of stone. From Durrington they would travel down the River Avon, a symbolic ferry across the borderlands, arriving at the point where the avenue begins. There the procession would rise from the riverbank and enter the chalk-lined road like an orchestra moving toward crescendo. Each step up the avenue would bring them closer to the sanctum of Stonehenge, where the dead would be interred, remembered, or transformed into ancestor spirits. The whole landscape was a choreography of transition. Water, earth, light, bone. Not one part of it was arbitrary. Even the slight slope of the avenue downhill from Stonehenge to the Avon may have evoked descent into the underworld, or, in reverse, the soul's ascent towards something eternal. We now know that cremated remains have been found within the Aubrey holes at Stonehenge, 56 pits, forming a circle within the outer ditch, each holding ashes of the long gone. The number matches the Neolithic lunar calendar, suggesting not just burial but celestial timing. And what makes this particularly powerful is that isotopic analysis of those remains indicates some of these individuals were born far from the Salisbury Plain, some possibly near the Pressley Hills of Wales, the origin of the Bluestones. Others may have come from the granite-rich soils of Western Britain, or even further afield. These were not just local dead, they were pilgrims, perhaps even founders. So what does it mean then that they were brought here? Not simply placed in a barrow near their village, but moved across miles of terrain, sometimes by river, sometimes by chalk avenue, to this specific place of stone and sun. It suggests that Stonehenge was more than a regional monument. It was a spiritual magnet, a final resting place for the honoured, and a solar stage for the rituals that carried them across the Vale. This also reconfigures how we think about the landscape. Stonehenge was never isolated. It was part of an interwoven geography of ritual. The avenue was not a road, but a story. A journey for the dead, yes, but also a ritual reenacted by the living. We know that people returned again and again, Not just to bury, but to celebrate, to gather, to reaffirm cosmic cycles. And always the journey began with water and ended with light. Satellite imagery and LiDAR scans have further confirmed the avenue's alignment and ceremonial structure. Even centuries after its surface was ploughed and overgrown, its ghost remains in the ground, etched like a vein beneath the skin. Archaeologists have uncovered post holes and timber remnants at its junction with the Avon, suggesting that this point where earth meets water was once marked by standing timbers, or perhaps a wooden causeway, a kind of liminal vestibule. Not quite alive, not yet gone, and while this may sound poetic, it's also architectural. Neolithic Britons engineered their sacred space with astonishing precision. Stonehenge itself may be famous for its geometry, but the avenue is its compass needle. The full width of the avenue, its graded banks and ditch walls, its solstitial targeting, and its terminal point at a river mouth all suggest an understanding of both symbolic and structural design. They knew the power of line, the meaning of procession, the poetics of walking into alignment with the sun. Modern scholars, of course, debate. Some propose that the avenue was a theatre for astronomical observation. Others suggest it was purely funerary. Some place it within the context of Neolithic cosmology, others within regional politics. But perhaps it was all of those at once. What Stonehenge teaches us over and over again is that prehistoric people were not simplistic. They were not purely this or that. They were complex. They held multiple meanings at once. A solar alignment was also a road for the dead. A ditch was also a doorway. A stone was a memory. So the avenue and the river, bound together in the landscape, become something more than Neolithic features. They become metaphors, the journey we all take, from water to light, from breath to stone, from mystery to memory and back again. And just maybe when the sun rises and cuts through the centre of that ancient path, what we're seeing isn't just a celestial event, it's a reminder that no one walks alone and no path ever really ends, especially not this one. Before there were druids in robes or solstice sunrises, before Merlin carved myths into the bedrock of Britain, there was something simpler, sadder, and somehow more sacred. There was death. And before Stonehenge was a monument to light, it was a theatre of burial, a circle of grief. Long before the Trilithons were raised or the Sarsens aligned with the sky, the builders of Stonehenge dug a trench into the chalk and began placing the dead into the earth, carefully, deliberately, with a kind of respect that defies the condescension we often apply to those who lived 5,000 years ago. The very first phase of Stonehenge, begun in the 31st century before the Common Era, wasn't a ring of stones but a ring of memory. 56 shallow pits dug into a circular ditch and bank that gleamed white in the sun. These pits are now known as the Aubrey Holes, named not by their makers of course, but by the 17th century antiquarian John Aubrey, who stumbled upon the pattern and drew a diagram. What he found, buried and forgotten, were not just holes in the ground, but the earliest known formal cemetery in the British Isles. We call it a henge now, but that's a modern linguistic echo. The original enclosure was made from a ditch nearly 6 feet deep and more than 3,000 feet around, cut with deer antler picks and sharpened tools of bone. The material removed was not just cast aside, it was banked up into a smooth circular embankment, a ring of white chalk that would have stood out vividly in a landscape still forested and wild. Inside that ring, they dug the pits, 56 of them, each perhaps a foot wide and 3 feet deep, arranged with unsettling precision in a circle. The function of the Aubrey holes has long been debated. Early theories thought they might hold standing stones or timber posts, but now we know that many of them held something far more intimate, cremated human remains, most of them carefully buried in leather pouches or organic containers that have long since vanished, leaving only the ash and bone. This wasn't just a scattering, this was a deliberate patterning of death, and it wasn't isolated. Archaeologists have uncovered more than 60 individual cremation burials in and around the Aubrey holes, with estimates suggesting as many as 150 people may have been interred here during the site's earliest use. Some were placed within the holes, some around them, others along the inner bank. The cremation burials cluster near the southern and eastern entrances, suggesting a choreography to the way these bodies were placed, perhaps corresponding to some ritual, some story, some long-forgotten map of the spirit world. What can bones tell us? Quite a lot, it turns out, especially when they've been burned. From isotope analysis of the surviving remains, We know that these were not local villagers or labourers gathered from nearby huts. Many of the dead appear to have come from Western Britain, including areas like West Wales, where the bluestones would later be quarried and dragged to the site. Some had spent their entire lives far from Salisbury Plain, only to be brought here in death, as if Stonehenge was already a kind of magnetic endpoint, a funerary pilgrimage site, centuries before it became a calendar of sun and sky. These weren't anonymous peasants. They were likely elite individuals, perhaps leaders, shamans or spiritual elders. Their presence, even in death, turned this patch of chalky ground into something holy. The funerary nature of the early site is now widely accepted, though for years it was minimised in favour of more spectacular theories, sun temples, solstice observatories or alien landing pads, depending on which century you were born into. But the bones never lied, and the cremation circle at Stonehenge reveals a society already deeply engaged in memory, mortality and metaphysical meaning. The Neolithic Britons who built this phase of Stonehenge were not simply disposing of bodies, they were composing a sacred pattern, using fire, earth, and the remains of the dead to write something into the landscape, something lasting. Consider the sheer effort of Neolithic cremation. This wasn't a casual pyre lit on the side of a hill. It took wood, time and attention. At this point in history, cremation was not the norm across Britain. It required a decision to turn the body into ash and bone, rather than bury it whole. That act alone implies ritual, intention, possibly even belief in transformation, that the smoke carried something upward, that the bones, burned white, could be returned to the earth not as flesh, but as memory made permanent. The exact sequence of construction remains debated, but the ditch and bank along with the Aubrey holes date to around 3100 before the Common Era. The bluestones would not arrive for centuries. The massive sarcens came even later, and yet the cremation suggests that from its very beginning Stonehenge was marked not by stone but by silence, the silence of the dead. Over time, later phases of construction would obscure or displace these early burials. Some cremation deposits were likely disturbed or removed when the inner circles were rearranged. Others were simply built over, as if new religious meanings were laid atop older ones, the way a cathedral might rise over a pagan well. That layering of purpose from graveyard to calendar, from circle of ash to circle of stone, is part of what makes Stonehenge so enduringly haunting. This was not a single project with a clear blueprint. It was a living site, altered over more than 1500 years, a monument to change even as it stood still. The bones remind us that death, not light, was the first mystery marked here. That long before solar alignments or druids in white robes, someone knelt at the edge of the chalk bank, holding a pouch of ash, and placed it gently into a pit, facing east. That person is gone. Their story, their name, their language all vanished, but their act remains. A circle of fire and bone buried beneath the more famous ring of stone, the earliest cemetery in Britain, and perhaps, still, the most beautiful. The bones do not lie, even if the flesh is long gone, even if the names have scattered like pollen across the centuries, even if the rituals were buried with the hands that once performed them, the calcium holds on. In the thick chalk of Salisbury Plain, where the roots of wildflowers curl around the broken ribs of prehistory, a quiet revolution has taken place. Isotope analysis, a discipline not dreamt of by the men and women who carved altars from stone and lit their dead on fire, but one that now peers through cremated dust and tells us something haunting. Many of the people buried at Stonehenge were not local. Some came from the far western hills, some may have walked for days, others may have been carried carefully, ritually, perhaps in bundles of cloth and memory, from what we now call Wales. This was not just a burial ground, it was a destination. Let us return to the so-called Aubrey holes, 56 depressions dug in a circle, named not by the ancients but by an antiquarian with a pen in the 17th century, once thought to hold wooden posts, then thought to mark the moon, then dismissed, then reclaimed. Archaeology, like grief, is cyclical. Today we know that these holes held the burned remains of humans, at least 60 individuals, with bones still carrying the mineral echoes of the places they once called home. Cremation, you see, does not erase everything. While heat warps and cast chars, the structure of tooth enamel, that most stubborn of tissues, survives. And in its chemistry and the trace elements it absorbed during a person's youth, it records a geographical fingerprint. And so when researchers at the University of Oxford analysed cremated bone fragments from the Aubrey holes, they did not expect what they found. The isotopic signatures told them the story of childhoods lived not on chalky Salisbury soil, but on ancient granite, on land far to the west, the kind of land one finds in the Preseli Hills, in Wales. Why? Why would the dead be brought from so far? This is where archaeology leans into speculation and poetry. Perhaps Stonehenge was already, even in its earliest form, a sacred centre, not for a tribe, but for a network. Perhaps its builders imagined the entire island of Britain as their sacred territory, and this was its spiritual spine, a place to bring the beloved dead, not to hide them, but to place them in memory's heart. The pre-Cellar Hills are no accidental detail. It is from this region that the so-called blue stones of Stonehenge were quarried, hauled, and somehow transported across over 150 miles of rivers, marshes, and prehistoric obstacles. That fact alone has long stunned historians and engineers, but now it appears that it was not only the stones that made the journey. People did too, in life or in death, perhaps both. Here the story of the stones folds into the story of the bones. What if the very act of building Stonehenge was never about architecture alone? What if the transportation of rock and of bone was a single ritual, a joining of land, lineage, and spirit? Some researchers believe this was no mere mortuary site, but a pilgrimage destination, a place where seasonal ceremonies may have involved not only feast and fire, but the reburial of ancestors. Consider the Durrington Walls settlement nearby. A vast temporary community, it housed hundreds, if not thousands of people during key seasonal events. Excavations there have uncovered pig bones, cooked and consumed with haste. Tooth enamel on those pigs too reveals travel from as far as the Scottish Highlands and the Welsh borders. People came, with livestock, with offerings, possibly with their dead. And always Stonehenge stood at the heart of it. Not a lonely monument, but a magnet. Not a place to merely mourn, but to remember, to connect. Modern scientific advances have not only confirmed the non-local origin of some remains, but have also pushed the date of those cremations back further than once believed. Some of the earliest burials in the Aubrey holes may date to around 3000 BCE. That is 5 centuries before the Sarsens were raised, before the Trilithons, before the image of Stonehenge as we know it even existed. In other words, it was sacred before it was dramatic, holy before it was monumental. And this should make us pause, because when we think of ancient wonder, we think of height, of heaviness. But Stonehenge, at its origin, was a circle of memory, dug into the earth, white chalk scarred by fire and ash, and within that ring not gods, not kings, but ordinary humans, men, women, children, their bones curled and charred, nestled into pits like seeds, not buried in haste, but interred with the kind of care that survives 5,000 years. There is something profoundly moving in the idea that people would transport their dead across hundreds of miles, that they would refuse to let distance sever belonging, that even in a world without maps, roads, or shared language, a person from Wales could be brought to Wiltshire to be laid to rest in a sacred ring of chalk. It speaks of something deeply human, a desire for meaning that survives beyond breath, a love that outweighs weight, a circle made not for the living but by them, for those they could not forget. We must be careful not to romanticize. The people who performed these burials also lived hard lives, lives of hunger, disease, and possibly violence. But in their dead, we see their depth. And in the science that reveals their origins, we are reminded that history is not a single story, but a spiral, one that loops us back to the same questions, the same rituals, the same ache to make meaning. The bones of strangers, now known to us only through isotope readings and careful sieving, have become voices again, not with words, but with placement, orientation, composition. Each one is a tiny act of connection across time, and Stonehenge itself, in its silence, remains a monument not to conquest or to kingship, but to care, to the stubborn refusal to forget, and to the dream that somewhere in the centre of the island there is a place where everyone, at last, belongs. When the modern eye gazes upon Stonehenge, it sees fragments, scattered shadows of an ambition long buried, fallen Trilithons, tilting lintels, hollow spaces where once there was symmetry. But even in its brokenness, even in ruin, The bones of the circle whisper of something impossibly intentional, a shape that was never meant to be mere coincidence, never a simple assembly of vertical rocks. This was not a circle by accident. This was geometry, carved in pain and chalk and stone by people who had no word for geometry, no compass, no chisel of metal. And yet, they built a ring so refined that it took laser light to truly understand its shape. It was in the early decades of the 21st century that the stones were scanned in full, using laser technology developed not for ruins, but for the precision mapping of modern infrastructure. The scan was part archaeological documentation, part curiosity, but what emerged from the beams and the data was something no one had expected. The outer ring of Stonehenge, composed of sarsen stones capped with horizontal lintels, had been shaped with a deliberate curve. Not a polygon, not an approximation. A perfect circle, or as close to perfect as Neolithic stone hammers could manage. And crucially, the horizontal caps, the lintels themselves, were not flat slabs stacked across upright stones. Each lintel had been carefully, painfully carved to curve just slightly, each one rounding off the edge of the monument in a way the naked eye had never registered. And when the pieces were put together, the effect was astonishing. A ring not just of stones, but of intention. A ring shaped by minds who understood what a circle was, even if they had no numbers to prove it. This finding changed everything. For years, perhaps centuries, archaeologists and laypeople alike had assumed that Stonehenge was somewhat clumsy in design, a rough ring built by a rule of thumb and general sightlines. But the laser scans showed something else entirely. The builders of Stonehenge had not only shaped the upright sarsens to standard heights, adjusting their lengths to account for the slope of the land and keep the top line of the ring level, they had also sculpted each lintel to curve inward just slightly, in perfect concert with the stones around it. This meant they were thinking not only in verticals and horizontals, but in arcs, and they were not stacking blocks like children with toys, they were crafting joins. Mortise and tenon joints, the same principle used in woodwork to connect pieces of furniture, were carved directly into stone. The uprights were topped with protruding knobs, and the lintels were hollowed to receive them, so tightly fitted that some lintels remain in place to this day, thousands of years and countless storms later. It was a language of joinery spoken through flint and hammerstone, and it was used not just for durability, but for aesthetic precision. The lintels did not wobble, they did not drift, they completed the circle. This degree of architectural foresight in what we call the late Neolithic, around 25 centuries before the Common Era, is staggering. We are not speaking here of crude monoliths randomly placed for convenience or dramatic effect. We are speaking of planned structure, of pre-visualized curves, of blueprinting in the mind. There was no drafting table, no ruler, and yet they achieved a cohesion of form that modern engineers struggle to match in stone without powered tools. And yet the mystery deepens because the land was not flat. Stonehenge is built on a gentle incline, a few degrees at most, but enough that if each upright stone had been made to identical height, the lintel line would have wobbled, drooped, failed to form a proper ring. Instead, the builders adjusted for this. The uprights toward the western side of the circle were made taller. Those toward the east were shorter. To an eye standing in the centre, the top edge of the ring would appear perfectly flat, perfectly level, as if nature itself had bent to human intention. That is not the act of trial and error. That is measurement, even if they never called it that. This is where the idea of a megalithic yard enters the story. In the 20th century, a controversial theory emerged that the builders of Stonehenge and other similar monuments may have had access to a consistent unit of measurement, somewhere between 82 and 83 centimetres in modern terms, a repeatable standard passed from mind to hand to stake, allowing stones to be placed with spatial coherence. There is no surviving ruler, no carved yardstick from the age of trilithons, but some believe the very stones themselves are the ruler. Their spacing, their height, their alignment all suggest a repeated cadence of distance, a rhythm felt through steps, rope, or intuition. The megalithic yard may never be proven, but it lingers in the data. Equally remarkable is the orientation of the structure. The main axis of Stonehenge is aligned precisely with the solstitial points, the summer solstice sunrise and the winter solstice sunset. This has been known for centuries, but the implications remain staggering. It means the ring was not only built in space, but in time. Its very shape channels the light of the year, capturing the longest day and the longest night in stone. And to achieve this, the builders had to understand where the sun would rise and set not just on one morning, but forever. They had to watch, track, and trust the sky. They had to encode the heavens into the earth. This is astronomy, whether or not they called it that. And so we are left with the paradox that always haunts Stonehenge. A prehistoric structure that is, by all standards, post-historic in design. Engineering without engineers, geometry without equations, astronomy without telescopes. The circle that isn't because it is more than a circle. It is memory, mind, and muscle made permanent. And while time has broken parts of it, while earthquakes and looters and frost have done their best to unravel the ring, the design holds. The curve remains. The lintels still lean into one another like old friends, curved just enough to whisper of a knowledge we never thought they had. This is not an accident. This is not chance. This is genius in the guise of silence. This is the ring that was never meant to be seen from the air, but only from within. Because the view from inside the circle, when the stone stood tall and the lintels met, was not just impressive, it was complete. And in that completeness, our ancestors found something divine, a shape that defied decay, a ring that spoke of eternity. So the next time someone tells you the ancients were primitive, bring them here. Bring them to the circle that isn't, to the geometry etched in ignorance of geometry, and watch as their certainty collapses in the shadow of a curve too perfect to be luck. This was vision made real, not by blueprint, but by belief. There is something unnerving about a perfect line. It suggests not just control, but intention, not just symmetry, but awareness. And when that perfect line is achieved not by chiseling into steel or programming lasers, but by hauling limestone and sandstone across miles of Neolithic woodland, with nothing but wooden rollers, rope, and human will, then you are no longer dealing with brute labour. You're brushing up against an intelligence history once underestimated. That is the quiet shock of what archaeologists discovered when they mapped the lintels of Stonehenge with high-resolution scanning. What appeared to the naked eye as a crude circle of rocks set down in uneven earth turned out, upon closer inspection, to be something quite different. A ring of perfectly flat lintels, aligned on a horizontal plane with a precision that would humble any modern surveyor. Except there were no surveyors, no plumb bobs, no water levels, no spirit levels, no known mathematics, and yet 4.5 millennia ago they made the horizon curve disappear. Stonehenge is built on a slight slope. It isn't dramatic, not a hill, not a drop, just a gentle, natural descent from west to east to cross the chalk plain. But even that subtle incline would warp the visual geometry of the ring if its builders had placed every trilithon and standing stone to the same height from the ground up. Imagine it, a ring that dips on one side, crooked like an unfinished crown. But the Neolithic builders were either perceptive enough to notice the problem or experienced enough to anticipate it. So what did they do? They calibrated. They measured not from the ground but from the horizon. They made the taller stones shorter and the shorter stones taller. They accounted for the slope by levelling the visual top edge of each stone structure. And when the final lintel was laid, the crown was complete, level, balanced, horizon-bound. This architectural feat was confirmed only recently, with the use of three-dimensional laser scanning. Researchers from English heritage and partner institutions mapped every inch of Stonehenge's weathered surface, analysing stone height, spacing, carving, and alignment. And what they found was breathtaking. The top line of the Sarsen circle, the lintels laid across the trilithons, formed a near-perfect flat plane. To achieve that meant each upright stone had to be deliberately chosen and adjusted for height, either by carving it down or sourcing stones of the right length to match the visual demand. This is not the work of a random pile. This is not a crude imitation of symmetry. This is measured, calculated, deliberate design. But how? Without trigonometry, without units of measurement we can reliably identify, without survey tools as we know them, and perhaps most shockingly without even the written word. These were oral societies. They left behind no blueprint, no scroll, no parchment, no visible instructional systems, but what they left in chalk, stone and geometry was a legacy that still holds shape thousands of years later. Some scholars suggest they might have used ropes and stakes, that by marking out circles using a central pivot and a string they could have traced arcs and angles across the field, that the levelling may have been done visually, perhaps by crouching low to the ground, aligning stones against the distant horizon. Others think water might have played a role, that channels or shallow basins of water which naturally find a level surface could have acted as rudimentary calibration tools, that they watched the reflection of the sky ripple, aligning their stones to its quiet equilibrium. It's all plausible, and yet every theory raises another question. Who taught them this? Who realised that reflection equals balance? That a rope pinned to a centre point can draw an arc of uncanny consistency? That matching the skyline was more important than matching the ground? In other words, who noticed the visual lie of the earth and chose to correct it? This is the kind of subtle genius we rarely associate with prehistoric people. We're too quick to define intellect by artifacts, by alphabets, by algorithms. We forget that intuition can also be precise, that you can understand the shape of a thing without being able to name it, that humans learned over centuries of watching shadows and sunrises what it meant to orient space to the cosmos. And here, with Stonehenge, we see that understanding set in stone. The slight variations in the stone's height aren't signs of error. They're evidence of correction. The eastern side of the monument, which rests on lower ground, uses taller stones. The western side, which sits on slightly higher elevation, uses shorter ones. The result is an upper ring that does not follow the ground but appears to float above it level, flat, almost artificial. And that illusion is the whole point. The builders weren't just stacking rocks, they were managing perception. This kind of optical sophistication suggests something more profound. They understood that their monument would be seen, that its shape had to look right, not just be right. That geometry was not merely mathematical, it was theatrical. They were building a stage, not just for ceremony, but for cosmic drama. A place where the sky met the stones, where the sun could travel a path that felt composed. Think about that. Not just building a sacred site, but designing it to read as sacred. A spiritual architecture made legible by light, line and illusion. It is here that Stonehenge takes its place not only in the Neolithic imagination, but in the architectural canon. Because it doesn't just survive, it still performs the sunrise on the summer solstice, the sunset on the winter solstice, the way the shadows stretch and retreat across its face, the way it stands in stark silhouette against the gold of dawn. All of it depends on sightlines, alignments, balance, and balance in turn depends on this simple but staggering fact that they levelled the horizon by unlevelling the ground. This may sound modern, but in truth it is ancient. Cultures all over the world align their monuments to stars, equinoxes, and seasons. The Great Pyramid of Giza is famously aligned to true north. The temples of Teotihuacan track Venus and the Pleiades. The Mayan observatories are calibrated to solstices and eclipses. But what makes Stonehenge strange is not its alignment, but its correction. It is the conscious distortion of natural slope to create the illusion of flatness that reveals the true depth of their knowledge. Not only did they track the heavens, they altered the earth to reflect them. So perhaps the question isn't who taught them this. Perhaps the question is, what were they trying to teach us? Because long before geometry had equations, it had story. And long before it had symbols, it had stones. To dig a ditch in the chalk soil of southern Britain is no easy task today. To do it in the 3rd millennium before Christ, without steel, without wheels, without anything more than a deer antler and a flint blade, well, that is something else entirely. Yet that is how Stonehenge began. Before the great Sarsens were dragged and dressed, before a single trilithon crowned the sky, there was a ditch, a bank, a circle in the chalk scooped and cut by calloused hands wielding the remnants of hunted stags. The first act of the builders was not vertical but horizontal, a ring drawn into earth, precise and ghostly, laid down not for shelter, not for crops, but for meaning. Around 3,000 years before the year called zero, Neolithic Britons dug the outer henge using picks made from red deer antlers. These tools, preserved in the chalk-rich soil, have been excavated in large numbers. They are worn, blunted, and broken, clear signs of prolonged use. Alongside them are shoulder blades from cattle, sharpened into primitive shovels. These too were pressed into service, scraping out the loosened chalk into baskets or perhaps animal hides, which were then dragged out of the trench. There are no shortcuts in this story, only effort repeated endlessly. One antler, one groove, one scar at a time. The ditch they carved was enormous, almost 100 metres across, with steep inner and outer banks. In some places, it plunged nearly 2 metres deep. They did this without iron, without beasts of burden, and without the metric system modern builders take for granted, and yet it is aligned to the solstices, to the sky, and perhaps most hauntingly to the dead. Within this carved ring they place the Aubrey, Holes, 56 pits whose purpose remains debated. Cremated remains have been found in many of them, suggesting they served as graves. Others propose they once held timber posts, or even stones now lost to time. What we do know is that each hole was carefully dug with those same antler picks. Some show signs of multiple episodes of digging and reuse, suggesting ritual activities repeated over generations. The chalk in the bottom of each pit was smoothed and shaped by tools wielded not in haste but in solemn repetition. Moving forward in time to around 2,500 years before Christ, the site changed dramatically. This was the age of the great stones. It is then that the colossal Sarsens and smaller blue stones were brought into position and the engineering marvel of Stonehenge truly began. But even here, the tools remained humble. Stone hammers, deer antlers, and flint chisels. Hundreds of hammerstones have been recovered at the site, mostly made of hard dolerite, sandstone, and quartzite. These were used not just to rough out the stones, but to fine-shape them, to create the mortise and tenon joints, and to round off the lintels. Every surface of every upright sarsen bears the pitted memory of those strikes. If you run your hand along the face of Stonehenge's monoliths today, you are not just touching weathered rock, you are touching thousands of moments of impact, each one a blow from a stone held by a human hand, lifted and swung with aching repetition. These marks are not damage, they are signature. The accuracy with which the stones were dressed suggests an intuitive understanding of geometry. The joints between the lintels and uprights were not simply stacked, they were carved with a tongue-and-groove technique more typical of woodworking. The protruding tenons atop the vertical stones fit into mortise holes carved into the undersides of the horizontal lintels. This held the trilithons in place not by gravity alone, but by design. How were these joints so accurately aligned? Likely through templates, trial fittings, and laborious correction again using stone tools. Experimental archaeology has shown that such work is painstaking but possible. Flint tools can be sharpened to a razor edge. With enough time and patience, they can carve even hard sandstone. Teams today have recreated the process using only materials available to Neolithic builders. A single mortise joint can take days to shape, and lifting a lintel requires coordinated teamwork, scaffolding, and precise counterweights, likely involving timber A-frames, ropes twisted from plant fibres, and a lot of shouting. The builders also used hammerstones to smooth and shape the visible faces of the stones. The rear faces, in contrast, are often left rough, suggesting they cared how the monument looked from within. This was a place meant to be experienced from the inside, where the dressed stones formed an enclosed visual and spiritual geometry. Microscopic analysis of the tool marks shows consistency between stones, suggesting that teams specialised in different tasks, roughing out, shaping joints, smoothing surfaces. This division of labour implies not only organisation, but apprenticeship. Knowledge was passed down not through written manuals, but by demonstration. This is craftsmanship embedded in culture. And still, the simplest tools of all were the most critical: rope, lever, fulcrum. To move stones weighing 20 to 40 tons, they likely used sledges pulled over greased logs. The journey from the Marlborough Downs to the Henge site was just 20 miles, but over that distance, through forest and hill, it became an odyssey. The blue stones, transported from Wales over 100 miles away, present an even more bewildering feat, perhaps floated along rivers, perhaps dragged overland. Whatever the method, it was not the tools that enabled the journey. It was the will. Even the ditch was not a one-time effort. Erosion, collapse, and recutting left layers that archaeologists now read like pages in a book. In some sections, the ditch was redug centuries after its first creation, suggesting long-term engagement with the monument. This was not a relic, it was a living site. We also find that animal bones, especially pigs, were scattered through the layers of chalk and silt. Many of these were feasting remains, suggesting that the work of digging, hauling, carving was not separate from the life of the community. It was accompanied by ceremony. Sweat was mixed with story. Labour was lit by firelight. The ditch was not just construction, it was theatre. And yet the most moving tools are the ones we cannot hold: time and memory, intention. These do not fossilise, but they echo. In every scar left by a stone hammer, in every antler dulled by chalk, in every groove that still fits a lintel perfectly after 4,000 years. The tools of Stonehenge are not only buried in soil, they are buried in the act of building itself a grammar of impact and patience etched into the bones of the earth. To walk the outer henge today is to circle the edge of this memory, to trace a path not made by machines, but by hands and hooves, grit and guesswork. There is no blueprint, no master plan, only the cumulative choreography of countless hours, measured not in minutes but in blisters, breath and belief. Stonehenge was not built by magic, but neither was it built by brute force alone. It was built by the human capacity to imagine, to persist, and to make meaning through matter even when all you have is a rock, a stick, and a prayer. There is a quiet kind of horror tucked inside the mathematics of devotion. To build Stonehenge as we see it today, the Sarsens in their circle, the lintels laid flat, the blue stones rearranged and repositioned, the avenue drawn toward the water, the mortise and tenon cuts refined to a hair's width of tolerance. To do all that with stone and bone and muscle would have taken an estimated 30 million hours of human labour. 30 million hours. That's not the kind of number you throw around lightly, and it's not the kind of time you accidentally stumble into. It is a figure that demands meaning. So let's begin by imagining what 30 million hours even looks like. If 1,000 people were building, digging, hauling and carving non-stop for 10 hours a day, every day of the year, it would still take over 8 years to complete. If they took breaks for weather or death or ritual, you might double or triple that span. And if the labour was more seasonal, as many scholars believe, aligning with feasting cycles or solstice pilgrimages, then we are looking at decades of recurring sacrifice. Not sacrifice in the modern sense of martyrdom or martyr complex, but in the Neolithic sense of sweat as offering, of blistered palms as prayers. Because no one worked on this alone, the monument we call Stonehenge is not the work of an individual genius, but of a civilization built around persistence. And perhaps that's the point. The point was not to build a thing, but to live in the process of building it. A theory has taken root in recent years, one that suggests the monumentality of Stonehenge was never about what it looked like in its completed form, but about what it meant to be part of its becoming. That the labour was itself sacred, that the pilgrimage wasn't to arrive at the finished temple, but to participate in the effort that slowly made it rise. This changes the whole picture. Suddenly, each groove hammered into stone by a bone pick becomes a rite. Every dragged sarsen becomes a sacred procession. The gathering of pigs at Durrington Walls becomes less a logistical feat and more a spiritual one. And maybe that explains the strange perfectionism embedded in this site. The lintels shaped to subtly curve into a perfect ring, the deliberate levelling of the circle across a sloped plane, the mortise and tenon joints fitting tighter than any timber temple. These weren't just builders, these were believers, and belief, it seems, is the true bedrock of the monument. Not in the gods as we might name them, but in the doing, in the repeating, in the returning year after year to lift another stone, fit another lintel, carve another groove. A devotion not just to the sun or the stars, but to the very idea that humans can shape the earth with nothing but time and will. 30 million hours, after all, is not just a labour budget. It is an inheritance, an inscription made not with words, but with effort. And Stonehenge, even now, remains a standing memory of that effort, one that humbles us, quietly beneath the weight of its pain. If you wanted to measure a civilization, you could look to its monuments, but if you wanted to understand its soul, you would have to measure its labour. The additional science now emerging from experimental archaeology and collaborative field tests across England has only deepened this truth. The people who built Stonehenge were not simply craftspeople or worshippers or mathematicians in animal skins, they were endurance-based theologians. Anthropologists studying Neolithic construction across the British Isles have estimated not just the time but the distribution of effort required, tracking what roles were most common, which seasons brought the greatest participation, and how food, death, and memory were ritualized alongside every muscle pulled and every stone placed. For example, recent reenactments by the Ancient Technology Centre have tested sled and log transport methods to assess the feasibility of hauling multi-ton sarsens over chalkland. Their trials show that with enough people, perhaps around 150 per stone, and sufficient lubrication from animal fat or river silt, such movement is physically possible. But possible and endurable are different things. It wasn't just about physics, it was about stamina, community and sustained myth. What archaeologists now realise is that these weren't isolated transport missions. They were deeply social and deeply symbolic processions, events that gathered communities from across regions, even across what would later be national divides. There is isotopic evidence of animals feasted upon at nearby Durrington walls, having come from as far away as the north of Scotland. This convergence wasn't for a quick build. It was for seasonal work cycles that doubled as festivals. Picture it, a population divided across hamlets and hunting grounds, all converging on Salisbury Plain for a shared labour that was also a shared story. Work that gave them reason to gather, trade, remember their dead, and retell the origin of the stones. In this view, the engineering of Stonehenge is inseparable from the engineering of the social body. There is also a new appreciation for the acoustic properties of the stones. Some researchers have posited that the spacing of sarcens may have created reverberations or sound traps, intensifying chants or drumming during ceremonies. In this sense, the effort wasn't just visual or tactile, it was sonic. They were shaping not only the sightline of the solstice, but the echo chamber of their cosmology. Some scholars now believe the roundness and smoothness of the lintels, far from being purely aesthetic, may have influenced how sound travelled within the circle, and thus how memory itself was engraved not just in rock but in rhythm. And the wear marks? Those aren't just scars of toil, they're Neolithic fingerprints. Thousands of microscopic indentations made from stone on stone show directional strikes, the Neolithic version of chiselling with purpose. Each mark contains a direction, a rhythm, a right hand or left. This has allowed researchers to distinguish between different tool types and likely even different tool users. They are now mapping entire surfaces to analyse the labour signatures left by individual workers, an archaeology not of bones or pottery, but of sweat itself. So what do 30 million hours look like under this lens? They look like the heartbeat of a civilization that didn't separate labour from love, effort from identity, or stone from spirit. Each hour wasn't simply burned, it was braided into story, ceremony, and structure. This was not just a monument that rose from toil, it was a monument to toil. A place where effort became eternity, and where the ache of the human hand became indistinguishable from the turning of the earth. You would think that after 5,000 years of wind, rain, and tourists with selfie sticks, there would be nothing left to learn about Stonehenge. But the truth is, the stones have been hiding things from us all along, not out of malice, but because our eyes were never sharp enough to see them, until now. Because in the 21st century, the archaeologist has a new eye, the laser. And when you shine that eye onto the surface of the world's most famous stone circle, what you find is not just erosion and age. You find graffiti, you find weapons, you find stories. In the early years of the 21st century, a complete laser scan was performed on every visible surface of every standing and fallen stone at Stonehenge. This was not just a digital photo shoot, it was a revelation. The laser, with its uncanny ability to measure minute topographical differences, revealed shallow carvings and surface etchings invisible to the naked eye. And among those carvings were over 100 axe heads, carefully shaped and clustered like ritual signatures. Axes, the ultimate symbol of Bronze Age power, embedded not by accident or idle vandalism, but as intentional inscriptions. The presence of axe heads is more than just a curious flourish. In the Bronze Age, beginning around the 22nd century before the Common Era, the axe was not merely a tool, it was a sacred implement, a weapon, a symbol of status. It may have functioned like currency or like a badge of spiritual rank. That these glyphs are carved directly into the sarsen stones suggests that people were still coming to Stonehenge hundreds of years after its original builders had vanished. They did not merely visit, they added their own mark, reverent or rebellious. In the truest sense, they tagged it. This adds a new layer to the myth of Stonehenge. Because if it were just a monument to the sun or the dead or the gods, it might have been left untouched. But it wasn't. It was interacted with, modified, personalised. This was a sacred place that kept evolving, absorbing the identities of its inheritors. Like a temple that belonged not to one culture, but to many. And this idea of cultural layering, of cumulative meaning, is reinforced when we look beyond the carvings and into the broader landscape. Satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar have revealed previously unknown features around Stonehenge, like the massive pits forming a mysterious circle around Durrington walls, or the long-buried post holes once supporting what may have been wooden monuments. Together, these discoveries suggest a landscape not frozen in time, but constantly being reconfigured, like a sacred canvas. But let us return to the carvings, because the axe heads were not the only things found in those scans. There were also daggers, knives, blades etched with care. You would think that after 5,000 years of wind, rain, and tourists with selfie sticks, there would be nothing left to learn about Stonehenge. But the truth is, the stones have been hiding things from us all along, not out of malice, but because our eyes were never sharp enough to see them, until now. Because in the 21st century, the archaeologist has a new eye, the laser. And when you shine that eye onto the surface of the world's most famous stone circle, what you find is not just erosion and age. You find graffiti, you find weapons, you find stories. In the early years of the 21st century, a complete laser scan was performed on every visible surface of every standing and fallen stone at Stonehenge. This was not just a digital photo shoot, it was a revelation. The laser, with its uncanny ability to measure minute topographical differences, revealed shallow carvings and surface etchings invisible to the naked eye. And among those carvings were over 100 axe heads, carefully shaped and clustered like ritual signatures. Axes, the ultimate symbol of Bronze Age power, embedded, not by accident or idle vandalism, but as intentional inscription. The presence of axe heads is more than just a curious flourish. In the Bronze Age, beginning around the 22nd century before the Common Era, the axe was not merely a tool, it was a sacred implement, a weapon, a symbol of status. It may have functioned like currency, or like a badge of spiritual rank. That these glyphs are carved directly into the sarsen stones suggests that people were still coming to Stonehenge hundreds of years after its original builders had vanished. They did not merely visit. They added their own mark, reverent or rebellious. In the truest sense, they tagged it. This adds a new layer to the myth of Stonehenge, because if it were just a monument to the sun or the dead or the gods, it might have been left untouched. But it wasn't. It was interacted with, modified, personalised. This was a sacred place that kept evolving, absorbing the identities of its inheritors, like a temple that belonged not to one culture but to many. And this idea of cultural layering, of cumulative meaning, is reinforced when we look beyond the carvings and into the broader landscape. Satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar have revealed previously unknown features around Stonehenge, like the massive pits forming a mysterious circle around Durrington walls, or the long-buried post holes once supporting what may have been wooden monuments. Together, these discoveries suggest a landscape not frozen in time, but constantly being reconfigured, like a sacred canvas. But let us return to the carvings, because the axe heads were not the only things found in those scans. There were also daggers, knives, blades etched with care. Some were stylized, almost ceremonial in their abstraction. Others were so detailed that the rivets in the hilt could be made out. And still others appear beside geometric motifs, like circles and chevrons, which may represent shields or stylized eyes. If this is sacred tagging, it is deeply symbolic. The axe, the knife, the shield, all carved into stone as permanent emblems of identity and intention. It tells us that Stonehenge was not just seen as a place of passive reverence. It was a stage of particip where stylized, almost ceremonial in their abstraction. Others were so detailed that the rivets in the hilt could be made out. And still others appear beside geometric motifs, like circles and chevrons, which may represent shields or stylized eyes. If this is sacred tagging, it is deeply symbolic. The axe, the knife, the shield, all carved into stone as permanent emblems of identity and intention. It tells us that Stonehenge was not just seen as a place of passive reverence. It was a stage of participation, and the audience was not voiceless. These findings complicate the notion of Stonehenge as a finished monument. It may never have been finished, not in the classical sense. Instead, it was a living structure, a ritual palimpsest. With each generation that came, something new was added. A stone moved, a bone buried, a symbol etched. In this way, it mirrors cathedrals that took centuries to complete, evolving with each mason and monarch. Except here, the religion is nameless, and the architects are anonymous. Scientific analysis of the carvings even reveals when they were made. Weathering patterns and micro-erosion suggest that many axe heads were added during the early Bronze Age, around the 18th century before the Common Era. That's over 500 years after the main Sarsen circle was erected, a temporal gap that challenges the idea of Stonehenge as a single-era construction. It becomes instead a multi-generational act of worship, and perhaps of politics. Because to mark a stone is to claim it, to inscribe a blade is to say, I was here, I am part of this is ours now. And that opens the door to another idea. What if the Bronze Age additions to Stonehenge were not acts of worship but of conquest? What if they were less like prayer and more like rebranding? A new culture arriving, appropriating an older monument and stamping it with their own signs. After all, the arrival of metallurgy did not happen peacefully. It transformed societies, rewrote power structures. So maybe these carvings are not reverent at all. Maybe they are a warning. Either way, they tell us something crucial. That Stonehenge was never static, that it lived, and not just in the sense of use and reuse, but in the sense of perception. It was re-seen by every generation, re-understood. The way you or I might look at it now and see a spiritual observatory, while someone in the 15th century might have seen it as a Roman ruin, and a Victorian might have seen it as a Druid college. The stone stays the same, but the meaning moves. And perhaps the most humbling part of all this laser-guided clarity is that it proves how blind we were. These carvings were always there, but until we invented the right light we couldn't see them, which means there may be more. Symbols beneath the weathering, motifs erased by time but recoverable by tech. Even now the stones are speaking, and we are only just learning how to listen. What the Bronze Age blades tell us is that humans have always wanted to leave a mark. That memory is not just carried in stories or bones, but in scratches on stone, and that even the most sacred monument can be personalised. Because in the end, the truly holy places are not the ones we simply inherit. They are the ones we add to, the ones we dare to rewrite, recarve and reimagine, laser by laser, blade by blade. It began with a hole, not a sacred one dug with antler picks in the chalk of Salisbury Plain, but a literal void and absence. One of the Sarsen stones at Stonehenge, massive and weathered as it was, had once been drilled into during a restoration attempt in the mid-20th century. A cylindrical core was extracted, a clean, smooth plug of stone about the length of a man's arm, and then it vanished. Not ceremoniously, not into a museum vault. It simply disappeared, lost somewhere in the files and furniture of a Britain rebuilding itself after war. And then, half a century later, it turned up in Florida. The story might sound absurd, but it is true. In the year 2018, a man named Robert Phillips, a former employee of a company involved in that earlier restoration, returned the missing core to British researchers. He had taken it with him when he emigrated to America, kept it in his private collection, and upon nearing the end of his life decided to send it back. That cylindrical ghost of a drilling job became a gift to science. Because once it was back in the right hands, geologists could finally perform tests that had never before been possible. For centuries we had known that the outer ring of Stonehenge, the Great Sarsens, each weighing over 20 tons, was made of sandstone. But sandstone is notoriously difficult to source. Its grainy structure forms in many places, and without a comparative sample of the exact interior mineral composition, even the best scientists were working with half-guesses. But now, with the core in hand, they had a direct sample, and the science got to work. Using techniques like X-ray fluorescence and mass spectrometry, researchers compared the chemical fingerprint of the returned core to over 300 sandstone outcrops across southern Britain. One by one, locations were eliminated. Too quartz-heavy, too clay-rich, too young. And then, at last, a match emerged. West Woods in the Marlborough Downs, just over 15 miles north of Stonehenge. It was a revelation. For decades, archaeologists had assumed that the Sarsens came from somewhere nearby, but no one had pinned it down. And now, with modern geochemistry, the path of the giants was made visible. The megaliths, so deeply embedded in the Salisbury Plain, had been hauled from the high ridges and forests of West Woods, a place littered with ancient burial mounds, trackways and other Neolithic traces. This was not a random quarry, it was a sacred source. And yet that raises a question. Why West Woods? It is not the closest source of Sarsen. It is not the easiest to access. To extract and haul stones that size over 15 miles without wheels or draft animals would have been a Herculean task. It required planning, coordination, and sheer communal endurance. So what was it about that site that made it worth the suffering? Perhaps it was the stone itself, The Sarsens at Westwoods are unusually uniform, dense and just durable. They weather evenly, hold their shape, and can be shaped with patience. For Neolithic builders seeking symmetry and permanence, this would have been gold. Or perhaps there was something older than utility, a spiritual resonance. The hills of Westwoods are rich with prehistoric activity, long barrows and henges and strange alignments of their own. It may have been understood as a place of the ancestors, or of the Weds, a place where the veil between worlds thinned. Whatever the reason, the choice was made, and from there we begin to reconstruct the great procession. First, the stones would be selected, then extracted, likely with wooden wedges, fire cracking, and the slow, splintering persuasion of human labour. Once freed, they would be dragged most likely on sledges across the uneven terrain, through forests and over rivers, across seasonal camps and feasting sites. It was not just a construction project, it was a journey, a myth enacted. Some archaeologists propose that this movement was itself a ritual, a pilgrimage of the living to mirror the journey of the dead. Along the route, feasts would have been held, offerings made, songs sung, and by the time the stones arrived at their final destination, they would already be holy, not simply raw material, but relics. The rediscovery of the core and the tracing of the Sarsen source is not merely a footnote in the story of Stonehenge. It reopens questions long buried beneath assumption. It reminds us that the monument was not a static object built in a vacuum, but a dynamic product of landscape belief and technological possibility. The path from Westwoods to Salisbury Plain was more than logistical, it was symbolic. It was a weaving together of sites, people and purposes, and even the discovery itself is a kind of modern myth. A missing fragment returned from exile, unlocking secrets hidden for millennia. The stone that wandered, only to speak again. In this, we see what science offers the ancient. Not coldness, but clarity. Not dissection, but depth. Because every chemical test and satellite scan gives us not just data, but story. It lets us walk the path of the builders, not in their sandals, but in their vision. And it humbles us with the realization that sometimes to move a stone is to move the world. There is a strange kind of sadness that clings to incomplete things, a book half written, a cathedral whose spire never rose, a song whose final note fades before it ever arrives, and standing on the wind-swept Salisbury Plain, surrounded by the broken ring of Stonehenge, one cannot help but wonder, was this ruin always a ruin? Or did its story end mid-sentence, interrupted by weather, war, or time itself? For generations, historians and mystics alike have debated whether the ancient circle was ever truly finished. The answer, like the monument itself, seems to shift with the seasons. To the naked eye, Stonehenge looks like a work abandoned. One trilithon stands tall, defiant and complete, its lintel locked tightly in place atop two uprights. Another lies toppled, its stones crumbled like tired knees. Elsewhere, half-erected stones jut from the grass like forgotten punctuation marks, hinting at a sentence that was meant to go on. And then, of course, there is the question of symmetry. Why does the circle break at one side? Why do some stones seem ill-fitted, misaligned, or missing altogether? For centuries, the assumption was that these gaps were simply the result of time's slow violence, weathering, looting, or careless farmers hauling ancient Sarsens off to build a sheep pen. But then came the drought. In the scorching summer of 2013, when England's soil cracked and the grasses withered, archaeologist Tim Dorr noticed something peculiar. As the lawn around Stonehenge browned in the heat, faint outlines of parched earth appeared in the southern arc of the circle, a sequence of ghostly rectangles exactly where missing stones would have stood. These parch marks, as they came to be known, suggested that the circle had once been complete, that each missing stone had at one time a twin, and that what we see now is not a mystery of design, but a case of loss. Of course, parch marks are not stones. They are shadows, hints, negative space. To some, they offer proof that Stonehenge was meant to be whole. To others, they raise even deeper doubts, because even if the marks represent real sockets, who is to say the stones were ever placed within them? Perhaps the holes were dug and abandoned. Perhaps a shipment of Sarsens never arrived. Or perhaps, as with so many great works, the builders simply ran out of time. The radiocarbon record tells a complicated story. The Sarsen Circle appears to have been raised around the 26th century before the Common Era, during what archaeologists call Stonehenge Phase 3. but excavation layers suggest that the site continued to be used, modified, and reimagined for hundreds of years afterward. Burial mounds rose around it. The avenue was laid, bluestones were rearranged. The entire monument was not so much built as curated. An open project, a Neolithic museum always under renovation. And then there is Stone 56. Known to researchers as the tallest of the surviving uprights, it leans slightly inward as though straining towards some ancient memory. But if you look closely at its base, you notice something odd. The stone is fractured, its lower portion, buried beneath the earth, seems misshapen, cracked. Some believe it was never meant to stand, that the builders had chosen a flawed monolith and raised it anyway, knowing it might one day fall. Others think it fell during construction and was simply never replaced. Either way, it is a stone that tells a story of compromise. In this light, the idea of an unfinished Stonehenge becomes less a problem of engineering and more a parable about human ambition. Perhaps the circle was never meant to be perfect. Perhaps the gaps, the broken stones, the absent trilithons are part of the design not as failures, but as intentional reminders that no monument lasts forever. In many indigenous traditions, imperfection is sacred. A woven basket will contain a deliberate flaw, a gesture of humility before the gods. Could Stonehenge be the same? A sacred ring deliberately left open to let the spirit pass through? Some archaeologists argue that Stonehenge was not meant to be a static sculpture, but a stage for performance. The solstice alignments, the interplay of shadow and light, the acoustics of stone and air, all suggest a monument designed to be experienced, not merely seen. In this context, the missing stones become not a deficiency, but a dynamic part of the ritual. They create entrances, exit points, lines of sight. The gaps guide the body, the procession, the ceremony. And then there is the simplest explanation of all, that Stonehenge is incomplete because time itself is incomplete. We are still in the middle of the story. Every generation that visits adds another footnote, another mark carved into the soft sarsen skin, another ash scattering, another solstice vigil. The monument is not finished because we are not finished with it. The myth continues, the pilgrimage lives, and the circle, though broken, still turns. In the 21st century, we have begun to see Stonehenge not as a singular act of Neolithic will, but as a process, a layered story, an archaeological novel with edits, revisions, and marginalia. Each pit, each bone, each fallen lintel is a word in that story, and the final chapter, perhaps, has not yet been written. After all, even today, when the sky is just right and the wind moves low over the plain, you can hear them, the footsteps of the ones who came before, the murmur of builders who worked with antler and sweat, the voices of those who buried their kin beneath chalk and circle, the silence of druids who stood in robes before a rising sun, and maybe, just maybe, the breath of someone who left a stone unplaced, because they knew, as we must know, that the greatest monuments are never truly finished. They wait, they change, they endure. There are no prayers carved into the lintels, no burial chamber holding the body of a king, no oracle, no altar, no scroll, only stone, only haunts and sky. For all its grandeur, all its heft, Stonehenge remains a place without a book. It stands not as a cathedral in the traditional sense built upon the word, but as a cathedral of science, composed in the grammar of shadow and light. If there is a scripture here, it is unwritten. If there is a doctrine, it is unspoken. This is not a monument that explains itself, it simply stands. And that, perhaps, is its greatest power. Because when you stand inside the sarsen circle, feeling the echo of 5,000 winters in the breeze, something strange happens to time. The tick and hum of the modern world vanish. There is only wind and weight and wonder. And in that suspended stillness, you understand why people kept coming back. Why they buried their dead here. Why they carved axes into stone, aligned lintels to the solstice, and walked barefoot across chalk paths to gather beneath these megalithic sentinels. Not for answers, but for presence. This is a cathedral not of certainty, but of awe. And awe, as it turns out, is one of the most ancient and universal human instincts. Long before gods were given names, before priests built temples or prophets issued commandments, there was awe. The The sky turning red at sunset, the moon dragging the tides, the sudden hush of snowfall. Awe is older than language, older than agriculture. It may be older than fear. And Stonehenge, in all its opaque geometry and unresolved purpose, channels that awe with astonishing precision. Even its lack of inscriptions becomes a feature, not a flaw, because silence is interpretive. It invites projection. Each visitor sees something different in the stone. To one it is a celestial calendar, to another a burial site, to another a place of communion between realms. The archaeologist sees engineering, the pagan sees power, the child sees giants, and all of them are right in a way because the site does not resist their meanings. It absorbs them, it holds them in tension, like the weight of its own lintels. And what of the builders? What of the hands that cracked bone to dig post holes, that chipped bluestone from a Welsh quarry and ferried it on rafts across rivers swollen with meltwater? We do not know their names, we cannot interview them, but we do know they returned, season after season, generation after generation, reshaping the site across the centuries. The early ditch dug in the 31st century before the Common Era, the bluestone circle in the 29th, the Sarsen trilithons in the 26th, and then finally the axes, the daggers, the final flourishes. This was not the work of a single vision. It was the result of cultural sedimentation, layer upon layer of ritual, memory and myth, a kind of architectural compost, rich with meaning but never fully decomposed. In this way, Stonehenge functions more like a language than a monument. It evolved, it responded, it held stories the way a hill holds rain, not neatly, but entirely. And perhaps that is why it still holds us, why even in the 21st century, with our satellites and sensors, our LiDAR and isotope analysis, we return to the stones with the same mixture of reverence and confusion. We come not to solve it, but to be humbled by it. Because Stonehenge resists closure, it offers no final theory, no grand answer. What it gives instead is something far rarer, a physical experience of mystery. There are few places left where mystery has mass, where you can reach out and touch it, feel its texture beneath your fingertips. But here mystery weighs 40 tons. Here it casts a shadow. Here it aligns with the sunrise on the longest day of the year, and you are not sure whether you're witnessing astronomy or magic, mathematics or prayer. That ambiguity is the point. That's what makes it somewhat sacred. Consider the term henge. It's not even accurate. Technically, a henge is a circular earthwork with a ditch on the inside of the bank. At Stonehenge, the ditch is outside. So even the name is a misfit, a misnomer that's stuck. But maybe that's appropriate, because nothing about this place conforms to modern categories. It is prehistoric, yet engineered. It is sacred, yet unclaimed. It is scientific, yet still inexplicable. And that is what makes it feel eternal. Not because it has lasted a long time, but because it seems to exist outside of time altogether, like the sea, or the moon, or grief. There is a particular chill to the Salisbury Plain in early winter, a dampness that seeps into the bones. That makes you aware of your body's smallness. Stand among the stones then, and you begin to understand what kind of courage it must have taken to build this. Not just the physical courage to move stone, but the existential courage to make something that would outlive you. Something permanent in a world where nothing was, where harvests failed, where plagues came, where winter always felt like it might be the last. And yet they built, not just a monument, but a question in stone, a cathedral with no book, a sermon without words, a gravity well for meaning. And now, thousands of years later, we return. We place our hands on the stones. We celebrate solstices, scatter ashes, stage protests, stage weddings. The monument remains, but the meanings multiply, which is precisely what makes it sacred. Not that it answers, but that it continues to ask. So let us not end with conclusions. Let us end with awe, the kind of awe that turns silence into worship, that sees meaning in shadow, that understands mystery not as a failure of knowledge, but as the root of reverence. Because in the end, Stonehenge is not just a structure, it is a state of mind. And that, perhaps, is the most powerful architecture of all. Long before roads were numbered or maps were printed, long before the Romans reached these fog-wrapped cliffs, and even before the first pyramid cast a shadow in Giza, something was happening in the west of Scotland. In a glen that now seems sleepy and peripheral, the ancients built a memory into the land, not a monument, but a living grammar of stone. Kilmartin Glen, A 6-mile valley streaked with cairns, henges, burial tombs, and spirals etched into rock like constellations caught in granite. And somehow almost no one knows it exists. We begin where the mist thickens and the sheep outnumber the cars. Just northwest of Loch Gilfhead, where the hills of Argyll collapse gently into farmland, you'll find a quiet museum and a quieter road. Follow it, and the prehistoric world begins to stir beneath your boots. This isn't a tourist Stonehenge. There are no gift shops beside the henges, no velvet ropes, no audio guides, only mud, silence, and the faint vibration of time. The landscape here does not announce itself, it murmurs, which is fitting because this was never a monument meant to impress from a distance. It was made to be walked, layered with presence. Every few hundred steps, another standing stone rises, not always alone. Some form lines, others form rings. Some are etched with spirals that only emerge when the winter light hits them sideways, like a secret that refuses to be seen too easily. To archaeologists, this region is a dream in open air. More than 800 prehistoric features, many clustered within walking distance of the village of Kilmartin. It's been called Scotland's Stonehenge, but that sells it short. Because this isn't just a site, it's a system, a cosmos built in cairns. Take the Templewood Stone Circle. Quiet, moss-lined, eerie. Older than King Tutankhamun. Flanked by trees that weren't here when the first stones were lifted, it's a place that confuses time. Look around and you'll see the Glen's Rhythm 5 massive cairns strung out like a spine, forming what scholars call a linear cemetery. It is as if the dead were being laid down in alignment, not for ease, but for meaning. A choreography of grief. Further along is Netherlargy South, one of the burial cairns that opens like a cracked geode. Inside, a chamber, dark, silent, layered in ancient dust. Echoes change here. Light shifts oddly. Step within, and you feel it, the Neolithic sense of burial, not as erasure, but as transformation. Archaeologist Dr. Aaron Watson calls it a trans-dimensional space. And for once, the poetic phrasing feels like understatement. This was a place for rituals we no longer know how to perform, for stories we forgot how to tell, for turning the living into something else. What's staggering is how much of this was almost lost. The Glen's wonders, though visible to anyone willing to look, were not mapped until the 20th century. It was only in the 1960s that two local women, Marion Campbell and Mary Sanderman, began documenting what the British state had overlooked. Their volunteer survey uncovered countless forgotten stones, burial chambers, pottery shards, arrowheads and beakers. They weren't just finding relics, they were finding memory, a memory the earth was barely clinging to. Even today the discoveries haven't stopped. Beneath a wind-blown hill south of the Glen lies Achnabarek, one of the largest prehistoric rock art sites in Europe. Covered in cut marks, concentric rings and horned spirals, it's a surreal canvas that only comes alive in low winter light. Some believe it to be astronomical. Others say it channels spiritual forces. No one agrees. And maybe that's the point. This isn't a site of answers. It's a landscape of riddles. Not unlike Stonehenge, but more spread out, more elemental, and somehow more personal. Because unlike Stonehenge, which imposes its mystery through scale and symmetry, Kilmartin Glen seeps into you. It does not need to be fenced or decoded, it just is. And in that quiet certainty, it offers something Stonehenge never could: the chance to wander unchoreographed through a sacred landscape. To lose yourself not in its grandeur, but in its grain. And perhaps that is why this place matters more than most. Not because it is more ancient, though in some cases it is. Not because it is more dramatic, though its silence has a drama all its own. But because it reminds us that meaning was not always built in monuments. Sometimes it was built in the spaces between them, in how light moves, in how stones stand, in what we choose to remember and what the earth refuses to let us forget. There is a kind of silence that exists only in places where time forgets to move. And in the glens of western Scotland, where the ancient burial mounds sleep beneath moss and mist, Kilmartin speaks through that silence, not in words but in echoes. These echoes do not rebound off walls or bounce across valleys. They hum inside you. They curl behind your ears like half-remembered songs. And when you walk the 6-mile radius around the village of Kilmartin, where more than 800 ancient monuments lie clustered like memories someone refused to bury, you begin to hear the shape of a question. Why did they build all of this here? To answer that question, we must begin with the stones. The standing stones, the cairns, the cists, the rock art. The very earth is a reliquary layered with ritual. At Netherlargy, a series of 5 burial cairns stretches in a line as deliberate as a spine. These aren't just graves, they are statements. They speak in direction, distance, and alignment. They tell us someone once understood geometry without words for it. Someone believed that death should follow a path, and so they built that path with rock. The cists, those small stone boxes for the dead, are so personal you almost flinch to peer inside. Some contain the remains of children, others ornate beaker pots. The practice of placing carefully decorated pottery alongside the body tells us that even in death aesthetics mattered. These weren't throwaway rituals, they were deliberate, they were artful, they were holy. And then there are the circles. Temple Wood, for instance, with its concentric rings of stones that predate the burial of Tutankhamun. The outer circle is neat, ceremonial. The inner circle feels more intimate, like a chamber for whispered incantation. Carved spirals and grooves wind across the stones like fingerprints in wet clay, evidence of hands long vanished. These symbols, the cup and ring marks, are among the oldest known forms of rock art in Europe. Some archaeologists believe they represent maps of the stars. Others say they depict the journey of the soul. Some see them as portals, none can say for certain, which is exactly why they endure. If Stonehenge is a symphony of engineering, then Kilmartin is a song of slow haunting. It was not one structure, but a choreography of sites. It was not built in a moment of vision, but evolved over millennia. Antiquarians first poked around here in the 19th century, but it wasn't until the 1960s that a fuller picture began to emerge. 2 local volunteers, Marion Campbell and Mary Sandeman, undertook the first major survey. What they found was not a single monument, but an entire world. Arrowheads, axes, pottery, quartz tools, and a village-sized map of prehistoric cosmology laid out in bog and stone. Since then, archaeology has tiptoed through the Glen inch by inch, unearthing 22,000 artefacts and counting. The new Kilmartin Museum now houses many of these, yet the greatest artefact of all is the Glen itself. The experience is not just intellectual, it is sensory. Step inside one of the cairns Netherlargy South, for instance, and let the light shift. Your ears catch the sound differently. The stones seem to close around you. The past does not feel like history, it feels like a presence. Dr. Aaron Watson, who has studied this region for decades, calls it archaeology of sensory experience. That phrase lingers, because it suggests that what we are uncovering here is not just data but atmosphere, not just fact but feeling. Kilmartin doesn't hand you answers, it gives you sensations. The chill of damp stone on your fingers, the smell of bracken and peat, the sight of spirals appearing in rock under slanted midwinter light. This is not a museum, it is a memory field. That becomes especially vivid at Achnabrek, one of the largest and most enigmatic rock art sites in the British Isles. Here, on a gentle slope above the trees, the rock surface has been carved with spirals and rosettes and horn symbols, some the size of dinner plates, others as small as fingerprints. No one knows what they mean, but many suspect these were carved to be seen at a specific time of year, possibly midwinter, possibly by firelight, possibly during ceremony, because when the sun hits just right, they shimmer. The stone itself glows. Some speculate these markings harness the energy of the land or the sky. Others whisper about ley lines, Celtic deities, or ancestral navigation. It is not clear what is truer, that the people of Kilmartin Glen believed their rocks could speak to gods, or that we still do. And what of the spatial intelligence on display? The cairns and standing stones are not placed randomly. They form sightlines. Some align with solar or lunar events, others with each other. It is a choreography, a map of meaning, not of place. And when you realise that almost every one of these monuments fits within a 6-mile radius, you begin to see that this was a designed landscape, a sacred district, a prehistoric cathedral complex with no steeples but many altars. Some have called it a Scottish Stonehenge, but that is a misunderstanding. Stonehenge is iconic because it survives in photogenic grandeur. Kilmartin, by contrast, is expansive, mysterious, uncontained. Stonehenge was central, Kilmartin was networked. And unlike Stonehenge, which was eventually abandoned, Kilmartin seems to have been laid over and reused continually for thousands of years. This is the Glen that keeps on giving, De Watson says, and it's true. The Glen does not feel finished. Every path leads to another clue. Every stone is a question, and perhaps that is the point. Kilmartin was not meant to be explained. It was meant to be experienced, like grief, like awe, like the kind of silence that makes you realise just how loud the modern world has become. And so we walk the winding trail one more time, under a sky that can't decide if it wants to rain. We place our hands on carved stones, 5,000 years old. We hear nothing and everything. The wind passes through the trees like breath. The sheep ignore us. The hill behind the cairn watches, as it always has, and something deep in the rock or in us hums back. This is not nostalgia. This is not escapism. This is memory too old to be named, and still, somehow, it remembers you.